The ground beneath me shook violently. I froze, my coffee spilling as the house trembled. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the ridge, the bluff right next to my home, starting to move. I rushed outside just as the first crack appeared, splitting the earth like it was paper. My heart dropped as I watched the hillside collapse, the concrete terraces the HOA had built tumbling into the abyss. I knew this day would come. I had warned them, documented everything. But when I saw the damage, I realized something even worse was happening. Someone was going to blame me for it. And that's when I saw the letter. Karen Riverstone was everything I'd expected. Arrogant, dismissive, and always a little too put together. As president of the Bluffside Meadows HOA, she ruled with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, like she was always one step away from pulling you into her web of control. I'd never been her fan, but when I first saw her standing outside the construction site, clipboard in hand, dressed in a salmon pink blazer with sunglasses that screamed power, I knew this wasn't about community improvement. This was about her ego. She called me over as if we were friends. "Kevin, so good to see you finally taking an interest," she said, flashing that fake smile of hers. But I wasn't buying it. I didn't need to play nice anymore. I handed her a geotechnical report, all laid out in color-coded detail, showing the very real risk of instability on the ridge they were building on. "This slope can't support your project, Karen. The earth beneath you will slip eventually," I warned. She barely glanced at the report, flipping through it like it was a nuisance. "We've had our own assessments done. This will be fine," she said dismissively. It wasn't just her indifference that got to me. It was the way she'd made it clear. She was going to do whatever she wanted, no matter the cost. And soon, it was clear. Her plans would hurt a lot of people, me included. When I bought the land on Sentinel Bluffs, I wasn't looking for a fight. I wanted solitude, the kind you can't find in a neighborhood where every house looks like a cookie-cutter replica of the next. I was a geologist, and this place called to me, not just for its beauty, but for its promise of peace, untouched by the humdrum of suburban life. No block parties, no HOA to tell me what color to paint my fence, no mandatory holiday decorations. Just quiet and the kind of view that could make you forget everything else. For 4 years I lived that dream. The kind of dream that only exists when you're far away from the noise of city life. Sure, the HOA sent me the occasional letter offering me an invitation to join, but I was always clear. I wasn't interested in playing by their rules. My land was mine, exempt from the regulations that governed the other homes downhill. That was the deal when I bought it. Then Karen Riverstone and the HOA made their first real move, asking me to sell them a small strip of land along the ridge so they could build a community recreation space. On paper, it sounded like a harmless request. But I wasn't stupid. I'd seen what happens when a greedy HOA gets its way. I politely turned them down, knowing what they were really after. When I refused to sell, the letters stopped being so polite. They started getting more demanding, like I was some kind of outsider they needed to corral into their perfect little village. But I stuck to my guns. I had my lawyer send a formal refusal, citing my rights, zoning laws, and, more importantly, my refusal to let them ruin my view. But Karen wasn't done yet. She was persistent, and I could tell from her tone that this wasn't over. The day they set up survey markers near my property line, I knew things had just gone to a new level. I hadn't been consulted. I hadn't been warned. I'd simply woken up to orange flags staked into the earth like a declaration of war. This wasn't about community anymore. It was about control, and Karen wasn't going to stop until she had it. At first, it wasn't so bad. Little things, easy to dismiss as coincidence. Survey markers appeared on my property, right on the edge of the ridge. They were bright orange, flapping in the wind like a mocking signal. I figured maybe it was a mistake, a miscommunication. But when I checked my mailbox, there it was. Another HOA newsletter. This one wasn't just a polite invitation. It was a formal announcement of the new Bluffside Vista Center, a community recreational space designed for everyone's enjoyment. That's when I saw it. The illustration. The view from the proposed terrace. And it was my view. My house was photoshopped out of the image completely, like I didn't even exist. I stormed over to the HOA office, ready to demand answers, but Karen wasn't there. Instead, I was met by a worker in a cheap polo, who handed me a business card for Riverstone Planning LLC, the company that was managing the project. Of course, it was owned by Karen's nephew. The first thing that crossed my mind? This was about a lot more than just community development. This was personal. They didn't just want my land, they wanted to erase me. The next escalation came without warning. I woke up one morning to the sound of construction, jackhammers, cranes, the unmistakable clamor of a development project underway. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, expecting to see workers maybe a few yards from the line. What I saw was surreal. A full-fledged construction site, on my land, a bulldozer just a few feet from my property line. I tried to speak to the foreman, but he barely acknowledged me. Instead, he handed me another card from Riverstone Planning LLC, just like the last time. I couldn't believe it. They were going ahead with this, ignoring all my warnings. And the worst part? Karen and her team had known what I'd said about the ridge being unstable, but they didn't care. It wasn't just rude, it was reckless. There were no notifications, no meetings, no permits, just machines on my property, claiming it for their own. This was the moment I realized it was no longer a matter of a simple land dispute. This was about power, and I was losing. The damage came quickly. First, it was the temporary fence that sliced through my view like a scar across a canvas. It cut right across the line of sight I had spent years enjoying, mountains stretching out in the distance, an endless horizon now blocked by cheap plastic and metal. Then, the trucks started parking on my gravel turnout, not a little over the line, all the way across it. Delivery pallets were left by my fence, bags of cement piled up right against the wood, as if they had no concept of boundaries or respect. It wasn't just inconvenience, it was defiance. They were taking my space, my peace, without a second thought. But it wasn't until I saw the first crack in the foundation of my deck that I knew I had a real problem. The construction site had begun to shift, and the fault lines that I'd been warning them about were starting to show. They were cutting corners. They were ignoring the very things that could have saved them, things I had written about, emailed about, warned them about. And here I was, watching the foundation of my life literally and figuratively crumble under their greed. I had no choice but to go to the authorities. I filed an official complaint with the county, attaching all my research, maps, photos, and evidence. The response? A generic letter from the inspector, thanking me for my civic concern and assuring me the matter was under review, as if that would do anything. The inspector, a young guy barely out of college, came to the site to check the fencing compliance, just the fencing. He barely glanced at the actual construction, and when I asked about the slope stabilization, he shrugged. "I'm just here for the paperwork," he said, as if the risk of a landslide wasn't his problem. The whole thing reeked of incompetence. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just an HOA issue. This was a systemic failure. But still, they kept building. The cranes swung, the mixers roared, and Karen strutted around the perimeter like she was conducting some grand opera. I had no choice but to keep documenting. Every delivery, every parking infringement, every inconsistency. And the worst part? The closer I got to speaking up, the more dangerous the situation became. Karen was becoming bolder, as if my presence was a nuisance to her perfectly orchestrated disaster. The turning point came one fateful night, just days before the rain started. I was sitting on my porch, bourbon in hand, watching the workmen pack up for the day. That's when I noticed the cracks in the lower terraces, visible fractures running along the foundation of the concrete. I pulled up the moisture data from my sensors, historical levels, stress points, soil saturation. The numbers were terrifying. We were on the verge of a collapse. The hillside was destabilizing. And the worst part? It wasn't a matter of if it would happen. It was a matter of when. I sent off one last report to the HOA, the city, and the county. I attached my findings, the data, everything that screamed, "This project is doomed." I knew it wouldn't make a difference. They'd never listen to me, but I had to try. So I hit send and watched the rain start to fall. And that's when I heard it, an ominous crack, followed by a low rumble. The hillside shifted, the sound of earth moving, trees cracking, concrete snapping. The landslide had begun. The community meeting was a circus. It wasn't even held in the usual HOA clubhouse. No, they'd set up a tent near the construction site, right by the unstable ridge. Karen, looking every bit the suburban queen in her salmon-pink blazer, stood at the front, microphone in hand. She smiled like she was about to announce a new world order, but everyone knew the truth. The bluff was collapsing, And it was all because of her reckless vanity project. When the floor opened for questions, I stood up, calmly walking to the microphone. I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Karen's fake smile faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. I didn't waste any time. I slid a thick stack of reports across the podium, landing with a thud. "You want to know why your pavilion is crumbling into the abyss?" I asked, voice steady. "Because of this." I laid out the documents, the geological surveys, the moisture levels, the safety reports, all the evidence that Karen and the HOA had ignored. I even pulled out a photo of the construction site from a few days ago, cracks already showing in the foundation. "You built on a ticking time bomb. This is on you." The room went silent as I dropped the final bombshell, the email chain I'd discovered between Karen, Tyler, and Councilman Drake. The emails were damning, proof that Karen had pushed through permits without the proper environmental review, that she had worked behind closed doors to avoid scrutiny. I handed the printed emails to the person managing the projector, and within seconds the screen flickered to life. There, in black and white, was the evidence. Councilman Drake's name, Karen's scheming, and Tyler's involvement, all laid bare for everyone to see. Karen's face drained of color as the audience processed what they were seeing. She tried to deflect, claiming that the process had been followed to the letter. But the emails didn't lie. Her voice wavered as she stumbled through an explanation, but it was too late. The truth had been laid bare. It was over. Karen's polished persona shattered in an instant. She tried to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. Her excuses crumbled under the weight of the evidence, her tightly controlled world slipping through her fingers. The audience, once cheering her on for her vision of a community pavilion, now looked at her with contempt. The same people who had clapped for her when she made her speeches were now silent, exchanging glances and murmuring among themselves. The final blow came when the anchor turned to Karen, asking, "Do you regret not listening to the warnings about the site's instability?" For a brief, painful moment, Karen hesitated. Her hand shook as she reached for the microphone. "Of course," she said, her voice cracking. "But the project was approved, and we had no reason to believe—" The anchor interrupted, showing the final email, the one where Karen had explicitly requested the bypass of environmental reviews. Karen's eyes widened, her shoulders slumped. In a split second, her entire facade crumbled. "You threw him under the bus," I whispered under my breath, watching as Karen's lies unraveled, and the room fell silent. The camera caught it all, her admission of guilt. Her career was over in the span of a few seconds. The broadcast went viral. Within hours, the community was abuzz with talk of Karen's betrayal. The headlines were savage, the truth now impossible to ignore. Karen Riverstone had tried to play God with people's lives, and now she would pay the price. The dust hadn't even settled before I felt the weight of everything that had happened. The landslide, the lies, the battle with the HOA. It all felt like it had happened to someone else. Someone far removed from the man now standing at the edge of a broken ridge, watching as the community around me slowly began to heal. I watched the cleanup crews as they moved in, removing the broken concrete and twisted metal that had once been Karen's so-called legacy. But there was something different about the atmosphere now. The once perfect little neighborhood, the sterile, quiet boxes that had suffocated the individuality of its residents, was beginning to stir with a new energy. People who had kept their heads down for years were starting to speak up. Conversations in the street were no longer just about property values or lawn care. They were about holding people accountable. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now came to my door, cautiously, as though they weren't sure whether I would still be angry with them for not speaking up sooner. Some apologized for not taking me seriously. Others just wanted to understand how the hell we ended up in this mess. It was surreal, but it felt good to see the community waking up to the truth, to see the facade that Karen and her cronies had built start to fall apart. Some of them even came to me with a new sense of purpose, asking how they could help hold the remaining HOA board members accountable. One neighbor, Tom, who'd always been on the HOA's side, even asked if I'd consider running for a seat on the board. I had to laugh, but the idea of change was real. It was happening, and it wasn't just me fighting anymore. The entire neighborhood was starting to understand that power, when misused, has consequences. The legal fallout came fast and heavy. The insurance company for Bluffside Meadows, after reviewing all the evidence, made their stance clear in public. They invoked the known risk exclusion clause, and Karen's HOA wasn't getting a single penny from them. Not a dime. The community's multi-million-dollar insurance payout was nullified, and the HOA's reserves were drained in the process of cleaning up the mess they'd made. As for Karen, Tyler, and Ellis Drake, the court cases started rolling in. They had no choice but to face the consequences. Karen was sentenced to 18 months, 5 of them in county jail, the rest on probation. She was barred from holding any kind of public office for the next decade, her career officially ruined. Ellis Drake, the councilman, got 2 years of probation and a hefty fine. The man who had been so smug at the 4th of July BBQs was now a pariah in the political world, his reputation permanently tainted. Tyler Riverstone? Well, karma came swiftly for him too. He lost his contractor's license and his fledgling business crumbled. As for his future career? Selling water filters at a hardware store might have been a step up, but no one ever saw him as a reputable professional again. The once proud Riverstone family name had been tarnished beyond repair. By the time the district attorney had wrapped up their investigation, the HOA was done. It was officially dissolved, its remaining assets, just over $3 million, divided up. Some of it was used for restitution to the homeowners whose properties had been damaged. The rest was funneled into environmental restoration for the bluff. The landslide zone was reclassified as a protected ecological transition zone by the city. Nothing could be built there for at least 15 years. No more development, no more construction. What was once a scar of arrogance and greed was now a quiet, reclaimed part of nature. As for me, the final blow came when the county awarded me a settlement of $185,000 for legal fees, stress, and reputational damage. It wasn't about the money. The real victory, the one I'll always cherish, was standing at the fence line and watching the final traces of the failed project being hauled away. A single wooden sign stood at the edge of the bluff, a remnant of the battle. It wasn't placed by the HOA or the city. I'm not even sure who put it there. It read, "I warned you." And beneath it, I didn't join, I didn't back down, I didn't put it there, but I left it up. I smiled to myself as I stood there, watching the grass slowly creep back over the scar that had once been the HOA's proudest achievement. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. The fight was over, and somehow, through all of it, I had won, not just the legal battle, but something more important, my freedom. The saga of Bluffside Meadows ended with the truth, and with it, a community beginning to rebuild itself from the rubble of a woman's overblown ambitions. For me, the biggest lesson was simple. No matter how much they try to bulldoze you, some things can't be buried. And in the end, nature always finds a way to reclaim what was taken from it.